Imagine the arrogance of it. A management office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a trapped fly that never quite dies. Papers shuffled across a laminate desk that's seen 1,000 small humiliations play out on its scratched surface. A woman behind that desk, demanding a $2,000 guest surcharge from me, sleeping in what used to be my own spare room, in a building I'd bled sweat into for years. Threatening eviction, actual eviction. From a room I grew up visiting on holidays, a room where my mother-in-law once told me, with a smile so thin it could cut glass, that family doesn't charge family, except they did. And little did they know, the deed had already changed hands 3 months earlier. I was sitting right there, in that beige office, holding the keys to the entire building in my coat pocket, and they were still talking to me like I was some deadbeat son-in-law who owed them rent. Like I was still the man who needed their permission to exist under that roof. I need you to sit with me for a while before I take you back, because this story doesn't work if you rush it. It didn't happen fast for me, and it shouldn't happen fast for you either. Every slow, humiliating month of it mattered. Every silence I swallowed mattered. So let me take you there properly. All the way back to the beginning. Back before the surcharge, before the audit, before the deed. Back to a version of me who still believed that love, if it was real, didn't come with a price list. I remember the smell of my father-in-law's coffee that first morning we moved in. Burnt, bitter, the way he always made it too strong on purpose. Like strength was a personality trait you could brew into a mug and hand to people to prove a point. I remember the sound of the radiator in the hallway. That metallic groan it made every time the heat kicked on. Like the building itself was sighing under the weight of everyone living inside it. I remember my wife's hand on my knee under that kitchen table. Cold despite the coffee, cold despite the radiator, because some part of her already sensed what was coming before a single word of it was said out loud. We had just moved back into town after a layoff hit us both in the same brutal month. Different companies, same gut punch, same 2 a.m. conversations about savings accounts shrinking like ice in July. We needed somewhere to land. Just for a few months, just long enough to catch our breath before the next chapter began. Her parents owned this old 6-unit building on the east side of town. The kind of building with creaky wooden stairwells that remembered every footstep, radiators that hissed like they telling one secrets to anyone who'd listen, and a brick facade that had probably watched 3 generations of families come and go through its front door. They had a spare unit sitting empty, small, nothing fancy, water-stained ceiling, a temperamental kitchen faucet that spat before it flowed. A window that never quite closed all the way in winter, letting in a thin, persistent draft that found you no matter where you sat in the room. They offered it to us like it was some grand act of divine charity. Like we should bow our heads and thank God, and them, in that exact order, for the privilege of sleeping under a leaking roof that belonged to family. I should have known something was wrong the moment they made us sign paperwork. Actual paperwork. For family. A lease agreement typed up in the same font as the leases they used for strangers down the hall. The same clauses, the same cold legal language. As if love had never once crossed the threshold of that document on its way to the printer. At first it was $700 a month, which, fine, I told myself, I understood. Utilities, upkeep. Whatever story they needed to tell themselves to make it feel less like exploitation and more like responsible landlording. I paid it without complaint. I even felt a strange gratitude. The kind you feel when you're drowning and someone throws you a rope, even if that rope has a price tag stapled to it, that you don't notice until you're already holding on, with both hands. I want to tell you about the early days too. Because they matter. Because they're the part of this story that made the later betrayal cut so much deeper. Those first few weeks, my father-in-law and I actually got along. We'd sit on the back steps some evenings, him with his burnt coffee, me with a beer, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes in slow, lazy circles under the streetlight. And he'd tell me stories about buying this building back in the early 90s. How he and his brother had scraped together every dollar they had. How the previous owner had practically given it away because the neighborhood was rougher then, unloved, undervalued. There was pride in his voice when he talked about it. Real pride. the kind that made me, for a while, genuinely admire him. My mother-in-law would come down sometimes with a plate of something, pakoras, or a slice of cake, or leftover biryani wrapped carefully in foil, and set it wordlessly on the step between us. Her way of saying she was glad we were close by, glad her daughter wasn't far from home during a hard season of life. I remember thinking, in those early weeks, that maybe this was exactly what family was supposed to look like. Messy, a little transactional around the edges, but warm underneath it all. That warmth didn't last the winter. The first crack came in September, small enough that I almost didn't notice it at the time. My father-in-law mentioned, almost casually, over dinner, that the insurance premium on the building had gone up. Then, a week later, that the city had sent a notice about the exterior stairwell railing being slightly out of code. Then, the week after that, a plumber's invoice for a burst pipe in Unit 4, the one just below ours, water damage spreading across a ceiling that wasn't even ours to worry about. Each conversation ended the same way. A sigh, a rub of the temple, a quiet mention that money was tighter than usual this year. I didn't think much of it. I offered to help where I could, fixed the stairwell railing myself with parts I bought out of my own pocket, spent a Saturday afternoon on my knees with a wrench under that ceiling in Unit 4, because that's what family does, or what I still believed family did back then. Then came the administrative fee. $50, tacked onto October's rent with no explanation, mentioned once in passing at dinner like it was nothing, like it was the weather, like it wasn't the first stone in what would become an avalanche. Then the seasonal maintenance surcharge. $120 in November, for a furnace that hadn't been serviced in 3 years, for pipes that groaned and complained through every cold snap, for a roof that let a slow, patient drip of water stain a corner of our bedroom's ceiling into the shape of a crooked continent, a shape I would come to know intimately, over many sleepless nights that followed. I remember asking my father-in-law about it directly. One evening, on those same back steps where we used to talk so easily, I asked him, gently, why the fees kept climbing when the furnace still hadn't been serviced, when the roof still leaked, when the railing I'd fixed myself was the only piece of that building that had actually improved. All year, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked out at the empty street instead, turned his mug slowly in his hands and said, "Things are complicated right now. You wouldn't understand the full picture." And that was it. Confrontation over, no further explanation offered, none invited. I didn't push. That was my mistake, maybe. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all, just patience wearing a disguise it hadn't yet revealed itself to be. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, on a rainy morning in late October with the windows fogged up, and my wife's hands trembling around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, they slid a new lease across that same laminate table and said the number out loud like it was nothing at all. Like it didn't carry the weight of a wrecking ball swinging straight through the middle of our lives. $2,000 a month. Or we'd need to be out by the end of the week. $2,000. For a spare room in a building I'd shoveled snow off of every single winter at hours no reasonable person should be awake. For a unit I'd patched drywall in with my own hands, sanded and painted over a weekend, while my wife brought me sandwiches and laughed at the paint on my forehead. For a building where I'd fixed a leaking pipe at 2 in the morning. Flashlight clenched in my teeth. Freezing water soaking through my sleeve up to the elbow, while they slept soundly upstairs in their newer, nicer unit, with the good radiators, and the roof that didn't leak a single drop. I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Really sit with it. Because it's not a feeling most people get to describe out loud, not without someone telling them they're overreacting, that it's just business, that they should be grateful for the roof at all. It's the specific, quiet humiliation of being priced out of your own family. It's not just financial, though the financial part alone is brutal enough to keep you up at night, doing math you don't want to do. It's a small, private earthquake in your chest that nobody else around you can see happening. You start replaying every holiday dinner in your head on a loop, every "we're so glad you're here," every hug at the door that suddenly, retroactively, feels like it had fine print stapled quietly to the back of it. Fine print you never once thought to read, because you never imagined you'd need to. My wife cried that night. Not loud, dramatic crying. The kind that's actually worse, the kind that leaks out sideways while she stared at the ceiling, at that crooked continent water stain, trying so hard not to wake anyone, not to give her own parents the satisfaction of hearing her break under their roof. I lay there beside her in the dark, listening to the radiator hiss its secrets down the hall, and something in me went very, very still. Not angry. Not yet. Anger would have been easy, and easy wasn't going to fix anything, and I already understood, on some instinctive level, that these were not people who could be reasoned with in the heat of an argument. They needed to be met somewhere colder, somewhere quieter, somewhere they wouldn't see me coming until it was already too late to stop it. So, calculating, quiet. The way the ocean goes quiet right before it pulls back from the shore, gathering itself for something the people standing on the beach can't yet see coming. Can't even imagine, because the water in front of them still looks so calm. Because here's the thing. Nobody in that family ever understood about me. Not in all the years I'd been folded into their holidays and their groups and their group photos and their family group chat, full of good morning messages and prayer forwards. I don't shout, I don't slam doors. When I'm hurt, really hurt down in the foundation of who I am, I go silent, and when I go silent, I go to work. I started making calls the very next morning. Not to lawyers, not yet. That would come later once I had something worth protecting with lawyers. First I called an old college friend, Priya, who worked in commercial real estate acquisitions downtown. The kind of person who could walk into a building and read its bones the way a doctor reads an X-ray, who could look past the fresh paint and see the rot underneath if there was any to find. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years, not since her wedding, but she picked up on the second ring like no time had passed at all. And something about the familiarity of her voice steadied me enough to actually say the words out loud for the first time. I described the building to her in detail, the address, the 6 units, the layout, the landlords who happened to be my father-in-law and his older brother, co-owners since the early 90s, back when the building was worth a fraction of what it was worth now, and the neighborhood was still finding its feet, still shaking off whatever reputation had made it affordable enough for 2 young brothers to buy in the first place. She went quiet on the phone for a long moment. I could hear her typing in the background, pulling up records, the soft click of a mouse, the low hum of an office I imagined full of glass walls and city views. Then she said something that would end up rewriting the entire trajectory of my life, though I didn't know it yet. Standing in a grocery store parking lot with my phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark that lasted an hour. That building's been bleeding money for years, she said. Deferred maintenance stacking up higher every quarter. A couple of code violations that never got fully cleared off the books. And a mortgage that's underwater more than they'd probably ever admit to at a dinner table. A pause, papers rustling on her end. If you're serious about this, I think they'd sell. Honestly, I think they might need to sooner rather than later, whether they're ready to face that or not. I didn't tell my wife, not yet. I know how that sounds. Keeping something like that from her, especially after everything we'd promised each other about honesty when we got married. Hand in hand. Both of us meaning every word of it under a string of fairy lights her cousin had hung in a backyard 3 summers ago. But I needed to know if this was even real. If it was more than a fantasy I was telling myself in a parking lot to survive the humiliation of that morning, before I let hope anywhere near her heart again. Hope is a dangerous thing to hand someone when they're already bruised. If it shatters, it doesn't just disappoint them. It teaches them not to trust hope the next time it comes around wearing your voice. And I never wanted to be the reason she stopped believing things could still turn out right. So I dug, quietly, patiently, the way you diffuse something instead of detonating it. Property records pulled from the county archive on lunch breaks, sitting alone in my car with a sandwich going stale beside me while I scrolled through PDFs on my phone. Tax liens I found buried 3 pages deep in public filings nobody bothers to read unless they're looking for exactly what I was looking for. A second mortgage nobody in the family had ever mentioned at a single Sunday dinner, not once, not even in passing, not even after 4 glasses of wine at Christmas when tongues usually loosen and secrets usually start slipping out sideways along with the laughter. Turns out my in-laws weren't just charging me rent out of pure, uncomplicated greed. They were drowning, and had been for longer than either of them would ever admit out loud, even to themselves in the privacy of their own bedroom. The building had 2 liens against it, stacked one on top of the other like a house of cards nobody wanted to look at too closely for fear of watching the whole thing come down. A roof that needed full replacement within the year or the city would step in and condemn part of the structure, red tag and all, forcing tenants out with 30 days notice and no compensation. They were charging me $2,000 a month not purely because I was family they'd come to resent, but because I was, in their eyes, a lifeline. A convenient one. One too proud, too used to being the ones in charge at every family gathering, to ever simply sit down and ask for help like an equal instead of extracting it quietly like a resource. That discovery should have made me feel sympathy. And for a moment, just one honest moment, sitting in my car outside the county records office with printouts spread across the passenger seat like a losing hand of cards finally turned face up. It did. I felt something soften in my chest, some old muscle memory of actually caring about these people, of wanting things to be simple and good between us the way they'd felt on those back steps in September. But then I remembered the way my mother-in-law had looked at my wife, her own daughter, across that kitchen table when we said we couldn't pay the new number by Friday. A look with no warmth left in it at all, like we were strangers who'd overstayed a welcome that had never really been extended in the first place. Not really. Not underneath the smiles and the foil-wrapped plates. Like blood was just a word you used at holidays when it was convenient, and dropped the moment convenience ran out and the numbers stopped working in their favor. So I made a decision that would take 4 long months to fully execute, 4 months of living under their roof, smiling politely at Sunday dinners, passing the burnt bitter coffee, paying that obscene rent on time every single month, without a single missed payment, without a single complaint they could point to and use against me later, while quietly, patiently assembling a financing package with Priya's help behind the scenes. 4 months of quietly courting the second lien holder, a tired, no-nonsense man named Marcus, who ran a small private lending firm out of a strip mall office and answered his own phone, learning the exact language he responded to, the exact numbers that would make him listen instead of hang up. 4 months of learning everything there was to learn. Every late payment on record, every skipped inspection, every dollar that had ever been pulled out of that building's accounts and funneled into things that had nothing whatsoever to do with maintenance, or roofs, or the people living inside those walls trusting that their rent was going somewhere honest. I want you to picture me during those 4 months, sitting alone in that spare room some nights, the television murmuring one floor above me where my in-laws watched a home renovation show without the slightest idea that the true renovation of their entire lives was already quietly under construction beneath their feet. I'd sit there with my laptop open, spreadsheets glowing blue in the dark, and I'd listen to the sound of their canned laughter drifting down through the ceiling, and I'd feel something in me settle further into that calm, terrible stillness. The stillness of a man who has stopped waiting to be treated fairly and started building the conditions under which fairness would simply become unavoidable. There was one night, near the end of the second month, when I almost told my wife everything. She'd caught me at the kitchen table at 1 a.m., laptop open, and asked, half asleep, what I was working on. I told her it was overtime paperwork from the new job I'd just started. She believed me, kissed the top of my head, and went back to bed. And I sat there afterward feeling like the loneliest man alive, surrounded by numbers that were about to change everything, unable to share the one piece of good news I actually had. 3 weeks before the deal finally closed, my in-laws hired an outside management company to professionalize operations. Their words exactly, spoken at dinner with a kind of self-satisfied pride, as if hiring strangers to collect rent from family was some sort of personal achievement worth announcing over dessert. A slick office opened up 2 towns over, beige walls, a framed motivational poster about excellence that nobody had ever actually read past the headline, and a woman named Denise behind the front desk, who spoke to tenants like she was doing them a personal favor simply by acknowledging their existence in her day. Denise, who would later hand me an eviction notice without once lifting her eyes from her clipboard. And on the day the papers finally quietly irreversibly transferred ownership into my name, not my father-in-law's name, not his brother's, mine, printed clean and permanent across the top of a deed that had taken 4 months of silence to earn, I sat in my car outside the title office for almost 20 minutes afterward. Just breathing, just letting it settle into my bones. I remember calling Priya first, my voice cracking on the first word, and her laughing softly on the other end and saying, now the real work starts. She was right. Because 11 days later, Denise called me into that same beige office to inform me, in the flat rehearsed voice of someone reading a script she'd read 100 times before, that if I didn't pay the $2,000 surcharge by Friday, I'd be removed from the premises. I sat down slowly across from her. I let the silence stretch just a little too long. The way you do when you want someone to feel the temperature of a room drop before they understand why it's dropping. Then I asked her one simple question, my voice calm, almost gentle, almost kind, the way you'd speak to someone right before you handed them something heavier than they were ready to carry. Denise, I said. When's the last time you actually read who owns this building? Denise blinked at me the way people do when a sentence doesn't quite compute. When the syntax is right but the meaning refuses to land, refuses to settle into a shape her mind is willing to accept. Her eyes dropped to the clipboard in her hands, like it might have betrayed her somehow, like the answer to my question was hiding somewhere between the eviction notice she'd already printed and the late fee schedule stacked neatly beside it, ready to be handed over with the same flat, practiced cruelty she'd probably used 100 times on 100 other tenants who never had a deed in their coat pocket to answer back with. The file says the property is owned by, she started, and I've watched her voice physically catch on the name. My father-in-law's name. A name that hadn't been true in the eyes of the law for exactly 11 days. Pull the county records, I said, still calm, still quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a room feel smaller than it actually is, that makes fluorescent light feel heavier somehow, pressing down instead of just glowing overhead. Not the file in front of you. The actual records. She didn't move at first. Her hand hovered over the keyboard like it had forgotten what it was for. So I reached into my jacket, the same jacket I'd worn to a dozen dinners at that house, the same jacket that had hung on their coat rack in the hallway, while they counted out my rent money in crisp 20s at that same kitchen table where my wife had once cried sideways into her tea. And I set the closing documents down in front of Denise. Every page. My name, black ink notarized, dated 11 days prior, sitting there in that beige office like a verdict nobody had seen coming. I watched her face do something I don't think I'll ever fully forget, not if I live to be 100. The blood didn't just drain from it. It seemed to physically retreat, like her whole body was trying to put distance between itself and what her own eyes were telling her. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, and nothing came out the second time either. You, she finally managed. Just that one syllable, and inside it an entire collapsing world. Every assumption she'd walked into that office with that morning, gone. Me, I said. I want you to understand something about this exact moment, because it wasn't the triumphant, chest-swelling scene revenge is supposed to feel like in movies. There was no swell of orchestral music behind me. What I felt instead was something quieter and stranger, something closer to vertigo, like standing at the top of a staircase you've climbed 1,000 times in complete darkness, and someone suddenly flips the light switch, and all at once you realize exactly how high up you've actually climbed, how far the fall would have been if you'd slipped even once along the way. Denise asked, her voice smaller now, stripped bare of its clipboard authority, whether I wanted her to call the owners. I told her yes, absolutely, call them. Tell them the new owner would like to schedule a meeting. Tonight, if at all possible, in this office. I even offered, with a small deliberate smile, to bring the coffee myself, the burnt, bitter kind my father-in-law liked so much, because there's a particular kind of poetry in serving a man his own medicine in a cup he'll recognize the moment it touches his lips. While I waited for the meeting, I called Marcus, the lien holder, just to keep him in the loop the way I'd promised I would through every stage of this. He'd become, in a strange way, an unexpected ally over those 4 months, a tired, plain-spoken man who'd seen 100 family business collapse under exactly this kind of quiet mismanagement, who'd told me once, over black coffee in his strip mall office, that the saddest calls he ever took were the ones where pride had cost people everything. Simply because nobody was willing to be the first to admit the numbers didn't work anymore. Handle it clean, he told me now over the phone. You don't need to burn it down to prove it's yours. I held on to that. I'd need it. They came in at 7 that evening, both of them. My father-in-law wearing his good sweater, the navy one with the leather buttons, the one he only wore when he wanted to look like a man firmly in control of things. My mother-in-law beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression already halfway to defensive before she'd even lowered herself into the chair, because on some level, some old animal level buried beneath decades of certainty, she already knew. You always know, don't you, right before the truth actually arrives. There's a shift in the air pressure of a room, a held breath that wasn't there a moment before, settling over everyone at once. I laid the documents out across the table between us the way you'd lay out a hand of cards you already know is unbeatable. Slowly, deliberately, no rush, no need to rush. Because the outcome had already been decided months ago, and this was simply the moment everyone else caught up to it. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would have been so easy to gloat, and some small, wounded, still healing part of me genuinely wanted to. But I'd made myself a promise, back in that spare room with the water stain shaped like a crooked continent watching over me every night, that if this day ever actually arrived, I would handle it with more grace than they had ever once shown me. Anger is loud and loud fades fast. Power doesn't need to raise its voice to be remembered. I told them plainly without embellishment. The building was mine now, every unit, every lease. Every single dollar of rent flowing through those old radiators and those creaky stairwells belonged, as of 11 days ago, to me and me alone. My father-in-law's jaw worked silently for a long moment, like he was chewing on words too large to swallow whole. I watched something behind his eyes flicker. Not just shock, but something closer to memory, like he was suddenly replaying every one of those evenings on the back steps, wondering how much of what I'd said to him, how much of what I'd fixed with my own hands, had secretly been the sound of a door quietly closing behind him the entire time. My mother-in-law's eyes went glassy, and for one disorienting second, just one, I thought she might actually cry, and some old tender part of me, the part that had genuinely loved these people once, that had defended them at family gatherings when others gossiped, that had shoveled their snow at midnight without ever once being asked to, that part of me nearly softened completely. But then she said it. The thing that hardened me right back up in an instant, that reminded me with brutal clarity exactly why I was sitting in that chair, exactly why 4 silent months had been worth every hour. "This is embarrassing for us," she said. Not "I'm sorry," not "how could we have let this happen to you and our own daughter." Embarrassing for us. As if the humiliation in that room somehow belonged to them. As if I were the one who'd overstepped some invisible line. As if $2,000 a month, squeezed relentlessly out of her own daughter's exhausted, trembling hands hadn't been the actual embarrassment sitting at this table all along. Long before I ever walked in holding a deed. That's when the calculating part of me, the part that had spent 4 silent months building spreadsheets by lamplight, reading liens, line by line until the words blurred, learning a language of easements and encumbrances I'd never needed before, finally opened its mouth. I told them, evenly, that I'd already ordered a full financial audit of the building's past 3 years. Every transaction, every so-called maintenance fee collected from every tenant in that building, cross-referenced against actual repairs made, actual permits pulled, actual invoices paid to actual contractors. Priya had already flagged several irregularities before I'd even walked into this room. Money that went in one door and mysteriously never came back out the other side into a new roof, a repaired boiler, wiring that met code instead of quietly failing it. I told them gently, almost as if I were doing them a kindness. Because in a strange way I was, that if those numbers didn't add up the way the law required them to add up, this stopped being an uncomfortable family conversation over lukewarm coffee, and started being something with actual legal teeth behind it. My father-in-law's good sweater suddenly looked far too warm for that beige little room. He asked quietly, almost inaudibly, what exactly the audit had found so far. I told him the truth, because there was no reason left to soften it. Nearly $60,000 collected over 3 years under the banner of maintenance and repair fees that couldn't be traced to a single invoice, a single permit, a single contractor's signature. $60,000 that had gone somewhere. A second car sitting in their driveway that I'd always assumed was a good year's at his own job. A vacation to the coast 2 summers back that they'd posted photos of with captions about blessings and gratitude. A renovation of their own unit's kitchen, with granite countertops, that gleamed under the recessed lighting they'd also had installed. $60,000 quietly rerouted from a building, slowly falling apart under people who couldn't afford to fix it, into a life that looked, from the outside, like everything was just fine. My mother-in-law's composure finally cracked, not into tears exactly, but into something rawer. A kind of stunned, wordless stillness, like watching someone realize, in real time, that a story they'd been telling themselves for years had just been read back to them by someone who actually had the receipts. And then I did the thing I had been quietly, patiently preparing to do for 4 long months. The thing this whole story had been building toward since the very first word of the hook, since the moment I told you about a management office demanding money it had no right to demand. I slid the termination letter across the table, addressed to their precious management company, effective immediately, along with formal written notice that all future tenant communications, all rent collection, every decision about that building's future, would now run through me directly. No more Denise. No more beige office with its unread motivational poster. No more clipboard justice dispensed by strangers who had never once shoveled a single flake of snow off front steps in the freezing dark. I watched 2 people who had spent months treating my wife and me like inconvenient, overdue tenants suddenly, visibly realize they were now, functionally, tenants themselves. dependent entirely on the goodwill of the very son-in-law they had tried so hard to price out of his own spare room. Here's the part I genuinely didn't expect. The part that surprised even me sitting there in that chair, watching their faces rearrange themselves around a truth they couldn't undo. I didn't evict them. I know. After everything, after the surcharge and the threats and the cold, careless arithmetic of who deserved shelter and who had to pay dearly for it, you might be expecting the version of this story where I hand them a cardboard box and watch them carry it down the same stairs they once threatened to throw me down. And I won't pretend that version didn't cross my mind more than once. In the dark, on the nights the water stains seemed to stare back at me. That ending would have been satisfying in the immediate, sugar rush kind of way anger always promises and rarely delivers on for long. But it wouldn't have been justice. It would have just been the exact same cruelty, recycled and repackaged, wearing my face instead of theirs. Instead, I laid out 3 conditions, plainly, the way you'd lay out terms in any negotiation. Because that's exactly what this had become. First, a new lease for their own unit, at fair market rate, nothing inflated, nothing punitive, the same rate every other tenant in that building would now pay, no more and no less. Second, full repayment of the $60,000 in unaccounted funds, structured over a reasonable timeline, so the building's real repairs, the roof, the furnace, the wiring, could finally be funded honestly instead of borrowed against tenants who trusted them. And third, an apology, not to me, to my wife. Spoken directly, without excuses folded into it, without the phrase "we were just trying to" anywhere near it. My father-in-law agreed to the first 2 conditions, almost immediately. The fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that finally being caught feels less like defeat, and more like being allowed, at last, to put the weight down. The third condition took longer. Pride is a slow healing wound, and his especially so. My mother-in-law didn't say thank you that night, not once. But 3 weeks later, she knocked on the door of what used to be our spare room, my wife's and mine, with a plate of something she'd baked, still warm, wrapped loosely in foil, and she stood in the hallway, not quite meeting my eyes, shifting her weight the way people do when an apology is trying to climb out of them and getting stuck somewhere around the throat. "The roof crew came today," she said instead. "Thank you for handling it." It wasn't the apology I'd asked for. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty is the whole point of telling you this story in the first place. But it was a door left open, just a crack, just enough light coming through to see by, and sometimes that's the most a person that proud can manage to offer in one lifetime, I decided, standing there with the foil-wrapped plate warm in my hands, to let it be a beginning instead of an ending. Not because they'd fully earned my forgiveness. I'm not sure they had, not completely, not yet, but because I refused to let their smallness make me small in return. I refused to let 4 months of silent, disciplined work end in the same pettiness that started it. The real apology came almost 2 months after that, at a small dinner my wife organized, cautiously, tentatively, testing the water the way you do after a storm, to see if the ground will hold your weight. Her father sat across from me, turning his mug in his hands the way he used to, on those back steps in September, and he said, without meeting my eyes at first, that he'd spent 30 years being the person everyone in the family looked to for answers, and that somewhere in there he'd forgotten how to be a person who simply asked for help when he needed it instead. He said he was sorry. Actually sorry, the word itself unadorned. Not for losing the building, but for the $2,000, for the eviction notice, for making his own daughter cry sideways into her tea in a house that was supposed to be a soft place to land. My wife cried again that night, but it was a different kind of crying this time. Not the sideways, silent leaking of a woman trying desperately not to wake anyone in the next room. This was the kind that comes when a weight you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it even had a shape finally, gently, sets itself down on the floor beside you. She hugged me in that spare room, right under the water stain shaped like a crooked continent, and she asked me quietly into my shoulder, "You never told me any of it. Why?" And I told her the truth, the whole truth, standing there with the radiator hissing its familiar secrets down the hall one last time. Because hope is a fragile thing, I said. And I hadn't wanted to hand it to her broken if the deal had somehow fallen through along the way. I wanted, when I finally did hand it to her, To hand her certainty instead of possibility. I wanted, for once in our life together, to be the floor beneath her feet, instead of one more uncertain variable she had to brace herself against. I told her about the nights at the kitchen table at 1 a.m., about the lie I'd told her about overtime paperwork, about Priya's voice on the phone in that parking lot, about Marcus and his tired, honest advice to handle it clean instead of burning it down. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't ask why I hadn't told her sooner. She just held on a little tighter. Here's what I want you to carry with you when this story ends. Because a story like this means nothing at all if it doesn't leave something behind in your hands. Power, real power, the kind that actually changes something, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with slammed doors or raised voices or dramatic exits. It moves quietly. It does its homework at midnight while everyone else sleeps. It waits, patient as water, patient as rust, for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. The people who tried to price me out of shelter, out of safety, out of the basic dignity of having somewhere warm to lay my head. They never once imagined that the man sitting silently at their table, absorbing every insult with a calm, unreadable face, taking notes nobody else could see, was already 3 steps ahead of them, already quietly building the very ground they would one day have no choice but to stand on. But more than that, more than the satisfaction of the reversal, more than the look on Denise's face collapsing in that beige office, more than watching my father-in-law's good sweater suddenly feel too warm for the room, the real lesson underneath all of this is simpler than any of it. Dignity is not something other people get to put a price tag on. Family is not, and should never become, a transaction. And the moment someone starts treating your shelter, your safety, your basic human need for a roof over your head, as leverage against you, you owe them nothing but the truth, delivered as calmly and as completely as you can manage to deliver it. I didn't buy that building for revenge. Not really. Not in the end, when everything had settled and the dust had cleared, and the roof crew had finally come and gone, and the granite countertops upstairs had quietly, wordlessly, been sold to help repay what was owed. I bought it because I refused to let 2 people who were supposed to love us unconditionally teach my wife,
their own
daughter, that love comes with an invoice quietly attached to the back of it. And if there's one thing I want you to take with you out of this story, into whatever room you're sitting in right now, into whatever quiet unfairness you might be carrying, without a single person around you knowing it's there, it's this. You don't have to shout to reclaim your own power. You don't have to slam a single door. Sometimes the quietest person in the room, the one everyone assumes has the least to say, is the one who's already quietly holding every single key.